Never underestimate the power of a good idea. Even with imperfect execution, a good idea can shape entire fields. I don't know in my entire career I'm going to have anything that is a tenth as influential as this article, but I still think it is my obligation as well as one to encourage my students to be able to try to understand the difficulty in doing research and the desire to try to do it better over time. And that's why I really find talking about this article by Collier and Hoffler back in 1998 as one of the more influential articles that we're going to read over the course of this entire semester. And this one helped drive the creation of an entire subfield, economic causes of civil conflict. And I think the takeaway is one that is intuitive and simple, and there's no need to get into the cost-benefit formula or to the cross-sectional models that they use using data to really get the takeaway, the important point. But I do think that understanding the link between general theories that we use words and using letters and math is one that is a transition worth making and at least thinking about the lessons and the benefits from using them. So for this article, the main argument is pretty simple. It's probably the most influential statement of the rational choice model of civil conflict. And the main point is that civil wars have economic causes. Grievances are universal, but wars are not. And they argue that wars break out when the benefits outweigh the costs, right? That we make cost-benefit decisions in our lives, right? Every single day, when we wake up, what we eat, who we socialize with, what classes we teach, what jobs do we search for, we look for when the costs are outweighed by the benefits, right? The difficulty, of course, is how different people might define the benefits and the costs for each particular outcome, because economics and rational choice theories are really great about the preference ordering. If you know that, you'll know the decisions that people are likely to make. However, how you come up with that ordering, assuming economic self-interest is a good starting point, but it is an incomplete one. And so let's start with the costs of conflict. There are opportunity costs to conflict. There's opportunity costs to taking this class, to watching this video, right? There are a lot of other things you could be doing, and joining a group and fighting instead of having a job that would give you income as well as increased security. But it's important to think about the opportunity costs of our choices, right? If you could be doing something else that might have a bigger benefit to you down the line, or just a different cost basis, the fact that you're choosing one thing instead of the other, it's important to think about what the choices are that you did not make, right? The road not taken. Wealthier countries, therefore, have most to lose because they have more economic activity, right? That if economic activity happens, war is disruptive to it, right? War is bad for business for a lot of people. It can be good for some people, but by and large, the expectation is war is bad for business. Paul Collier, after he wrote this article with Anke Hoffler, went on to contribute to a World Bank book, Breaking the Conflict Trap, in 2003. That was incredibly influential for policymakers and for academics as well, estimating that the annual cost to a country's GDP for having a civil war exceeded 3%. So that a country with ongoing wars, it's economically costly to it, so they would have incentives to be able to want to stop the conflict. So longer conflicts are more costly, and countries, all else being equal, that have more economic capacity have more to lose from ongoing conflict. So that goes into the cost part of it. The benefits of conflict depend on how likely you are to be successful, right? With anything in life, that if you stand to benefit, it has to be interacted with the odds of actually getting that benefit. The lottery is a clear example of that. The potential benefit is incredibly large, but the probability of actually getting it is incredibly small, right? And so you have to understand the probability of victory or the probability of outcome happening in conjunction with the benefits for being able to take it over. The rewards of winning, therefore, are in part determined by the amount of money the government brings in to be able to serve as a benefit of the conflict. If you take over a conflict in a country that has a GDP of 1 billion US dollars, that is a smaller benefit for a given level of risk than a country that has an economy of 2 trillion, right? Or whatever. That the larger the rewards, the larger those rewards are. That usually you can kind of measure it by the tax base, how much the government brings in from people and corporations and trade. So the rewards are given by tax base. It also determines how much weapons and other weapons, so things that would increase the cost of winning a war for rebel groups, as well as being able to provide benefits for citizens to keep them happy and to have less grievances. So the tax base in this article is determines how strong the state is when fighting the potential rebels, because they can afford weapons and infrastructure to be able to get those weapons where they're needed. And in this, on page 565 of the article, they have this this formula, which I know political science students often don't get into the study of politics because they love math particularly, but I do think that in this class, over the next 2 months or so, we're going to be seeing a lot of cutting edge models that are either, if not formal models, that ones that use empirical models that can be also modeled with math and equations. And the one takeaway I want to leave you when you read those kind of papers is that the people who wrote these things are people, right? They're not some AI in an IBM lab someplace. They are ways of trying to formalize the theoretical approaches to understanding conflict that everyone else uses, whether they use numbers or not. And I wanted to spend a bit of time trying to demystify these equations and how they're useful to try to distill a theoretical argument in a relatively short amount of space and incredibly explicit, and doesn't leave much out for assumptions that wouldn't be mentioned. And I want to see right here, right? I've talked about costs and benefits in the last couple of slides. The benefits are in the first part of that equation. So it's the benefits minus the cost here goes into that utility calculation. And so you have P is the probability of rebel victory, right? How likely you are to be able to get what you want. T is the taxable capacity of the economy, right? That goes in the benefits side. G is the gain conditional upon the victory. How much you get is given by the taxable capacity of a state, as well as the size of the population, P, and that is over the discount rate, how much people value, right, the shadow of the future or time. The cost side of the equation is what goes into that. Y, per capita income, and C, which is a coordination cost, how hard it is to be able to organize a rebel group. In the workshops, I tried to get you guys to think about what it would take for you to join a rebel group and how difficult it would be to try to coordinate who would be the one that would organize it, take the risks in creating a strategy to be able to take over the state, and that is also over the discount rate, the effects of time on this equation. And so hopefully you see that there's elements that go into these equations that are relatively transparent and that have a theoretical motivation, right? The taxable capacity, how likely you are to win, what you're going to get if you win, and the population has also an effect on what the benefits are, because the more people there are to work, the potential benefits of controlling them should be theoretically greater, right? So let's break that out a bit more for the proxies that they use for their empirical models. Probability of winning is shaped by the taxable capacity T. What goes into that equation that shapes the probability of winning? per capita income, which shapes how much governments spend on military, and the natural resource endowment, which is a percentage of primary commodities in the GDP. So natural resources, those are the concrete benefits that you can get from rents from those extractions, and per capita income is a proxy for weapons, which should shape your probability of winning. The more the government has, the less likely it is the rebel group should win. And the gains conditional upon victory is shaped by the size of the population and the per capita income as a reward to distribute or keep. It's interesting, right? Per capita income is doing double duty here. It shapes the probability of winning through the government's ability to buy weapons, and then the per capita income is also the gains that you get if you actually take over. So you see that doing double duty there, as well as population is a proxy both for benefits and for costs. The transaction cost of coordinating people to be able to organize a group is driven by cultural distinctness, which they look at ethnic fractionalization. It's a term that we're going to be seeing over the next couple of weeks. You might have seen it in your other classes, but it's a randomized measure of two people meeting on the street. What's the likelihood that they're both going to be part of the same ethnic group? In a purely homogenous society where everyone is the same, the score would be 1, right? You're sure to meet someone that's of your same group. And if everybody is different, everyone is completely unique of their own group, then that score would be 0, right? And there's been a lot of literature, we're going to see this later on in the term, that there's often a non-linear effect between ethnic fractionalization and conflict. The case study today is Burundi, which has roughly 80% Hutus and 20% Tutsis. That is similar to neighboring Rwanda, and a lot of the quantitative literature has found that the chances of conflict, given cultural distinctness, is relatively low if a country is incredibly diverse and heterogeneous, and incredibly low if it's homogenous and incredibly similar. It's those ones in which there's a large enough majority that the minority is less likely to win control, and that minority is large enough to be a relatively significant part of the population. And then, there's population also as part of the transaction costs. The larger the population, the argument is the easier it is to be able to at least find some group that can be able to band together with similar interests to start a conflict. And the opportunity cost for conflict, for fighting, is also given by per capita income. So you see per capita income come 3 times into the equation because it's a proxy for those opportunity costs of fighting instead of getting a job. The higher the country's level of development, theoretically, the more people's income and the more costly it is to join the group and join the fight. There's a lot of potential critiques to this approach, as I mentioned in the beginning. Theoretically, they're too quick to dismiss grievances. The grievance literature kind of fell out of fashion for a while when this greed took over, but I think there's a lot of more recent literature that kind of interacts, seeing both greed and grievance as important. It's not just one or the other. They could be interactive effects or complementary effects of driving towards conflict. Empirically, economists have a different way of doing things, and 2 of the articles today, they use cross-sectional models. They look at differences and the likelihood of conflict and conflict duration across countries and not of countries over time. And that is good at trying to compare country A compared to country B in seeing why is country A more likely to go to war than country B at that time in which they gather the data. But it's less useful in trying to say, why did a country break out in war this year as opposed to 10 years earlier or a year earlier, right? Was it something that varied over time? This is a kind of a structural cross-sectional model approach. And a very different interpretation of per capita income. Fear on Leighton is another article that's worth your time reading. It's a lot more complex, I think, to work through for undergrads, but the takeaway is relatively simple. They see GDP as a proxy for state capacity. That it's not about greed or grievance; it's about opportunity. GDP is a proxy for state capacity, right? They include state capacity in that cost-benefit equation, but Freon and Layton kind of say that GDP is really important because of that proxy for state capacity. That it takes means, it takes motive, but it also takes opportunity, and they focus on opportunity. So yeah, this article has multiple theoretical uses for per capita income and population, and now we're getting in the weeds, but by not logging values of their independent variables, it gives more weight to extreme values, right? If you have, how to think about it, for like a kid's birthday party or something that I can relate to, right? That if you have a string that you're hanging up a bunch of balloons and then you have a 50-pound weight at the end of the string, it's going to be really easy for that part of the string to get pulled down and to crash, because that increased weight of that one lead balloon compared to the other ones that are filled with air pulls that entire string down. It's the same thing with regressions. You can have a country that is huge in population or huge in income that can really skew results. And logging is a mathematical way to try to reduce the distance between all those different countries or people or observations. Last, the links between onset and duration were unproven and under-theorized in this article. There's a whole bunch of different theories, starting with a special issue in the Journal of Conflict Resolution in 2005 that really looked at why certain conflicts are likely to last longer than others and who's likely to win, right? In this article, they're just focused on onset and duration without really looking at those things as different phenomena, right? And with any of these kind of papers, the proxies that we use are imperfect, and they remind me of dentist kits from the medieval times, right? They're rough tools that, God, I would not want to go to the dentist if they use these kind of tools just to be able to replace a filling. But that I think we're in a lot of ways at the medieval stage at our understanding of social outcomes, and the tools that Collier and Hoffler and others were incredibly rusty and simple in the beginning. 20 years later, I think some of them have gotten better. Others are still at this kind of rough stage, but I think the takeaway is we're at an early stage and there are a lot of clear weaknesses, but you have to make your own cost-benefit decision with what kind of theory and evidence you provide. You can only have so much money to code new data or use other people's data, and so much time to be able to write up your papers, kind of like you in this semester. And so we have to try to reach for the tools that are the best that we can for the given job, which kind of leads me to the end of this segment. I'm interested in your feedback. Do you find greed an intuitive explanation for the causes of conflict? Given your particular interest in conflicts that you might have some experience with before, do you think greed was a prime motivator? Why or why not? I would like to get your take for students in my class in Waddle for lecture question number 1. For those of you who are not, you're more than welcome to leave comments in below the video. Thank you for your time, and let's turn now to different ways of trying to model economic causes of conflict and come up with a more representative, if potentially more complex model of economic causes of conflict.